So you had tried that or no?
I restarted that already.
Well, projector and this other screen is straight.
CBS, which is just right practically out my backyard. And there was a park hospital on that side, just across the street, half the road was CBS. And I'm still, I'm alive, trying to reconcile what my neighbor was on.
David did it for his class.
There's some, telling me the same thing out here. There are some.
It seems to me like the projector runs on these. Did this one come back to main screen? With the VGA, that way you did it. Yeah, we don't have this monitor. Did we have this before? Go for that.
Good morning. Yes. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you. And Lynn Gower's here. Good to see you, Lynn. Oh, man. So good. And those watching online, sorry we're running a little late. The rest of us are just getting here. And you've probably been watching online, wondering when are they going to start? I know that feeling. Please excuse my sinuses. They are active and working, like everybody in the springtime. We're studying from the book of John, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Of course, we always want to start with a prayer, ask for God's blessings, and Bobby Beasley is going to lead us in that.
Father, we're thankful for another beautiful day. We're thankful for peace and security in our country, and we pray for peace throughout the world. We're thankful especially today for the book of John, which tells us so many stories of Jesus and records so many of his words. We value every word that he delivered, and we pray that we'll learn his words and be more like him. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Very good. So, the book of John. Such a tremendously interesting book when you think of the number of things that are in that gospel that are not in the other three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Unique only to John, still all there. And you kind of wonder once in a while, why did none of these other guys at least touch on some of these things? But they didn't. And Matthew should have in one sense, but I guess inspiration of the Spirit, number one, and personalities do appear in the gospel. So you'll see John, you can recognize his writings and kind of what he covers and how he goes about things from his standpoint. He's unique from how Matthew covers things, and Luke the same way. And so all that going on, so it's not surprising to see a lot of interaction from John in personal situations, because that seems to be something that he connected to. I'm guessing it from that perspective, and definitely inspired by God all the way through. So John 4, we talked about this some the last time we were looking at this 2 weeks ago. And what we were talking about was the woman and the interaction between the Samaritan woman at the well that belonged to Jacob and the situation with Jesus, having this conversation. And there's a variety of things that are mentioned here. We covered some of that, about Jesus baptizing more than John's disciples, and John the Baptist, that is. And John the Baptist had some disciples still staying with him that became a little jealous because Jesus had more people go in his direction. And John's comment, of course, was that was the thing that was supposed to be, that God had always set that in direction. Now, so we dealt with some of those things. I wanted to come down to the discussion that Jesus has with the woman about the husband, and starting in verse 16. And we mentioned this 2 weeks ago, so there's kind of like they do on TV, they go back and say, remember last time we showed this? And so as we were talking about this before, the discussion that Jesus brings up is kind of different. As he is having an important discussion about living water, and the woman asks the question, his answer back to her, verse 16, is, go call your husband and come here. And the woman answered and said, I have no husband. Now, you've probably read this. And she pauses a second. Probably that was going to be her entire answer. And Jesus' response back was, you're right in saying so because you've had 5. As a matter of fact, you're living with somebody that's not even a husband according to the regular world standards. So the one you now have, verse 16, isn't even your husband. She has one, but it's not even a marital relationship as far as marriage. Then there's a discussion that comes from that about worship, because she perceives he's a prophet. And so she starts asking about worship, and Israelites say you should worship in Jerusalem. We worship on this mountain, back and forth. And Jesus' answer, verse 23, the hour is coming and now is here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. That entire section, when you think about it, stands so unique from everything that's mentioned in the New Testament about worship or anything else. And so had John not included that, we wouldn't have information that is pertinent, I think, in understanding about God's specific desire that we worship in the right way. Now, there are other things that are mentioned in the New Testament about worship. A lot of things mentioned in the Old Testament. And the laws of the Old Testament were different, and yet those laws in that time were to be followed the same as the New Testament laws are to be followed. But this whole discussion, now here's the reason I bring this up, is this entire section, when you think about it, could be totally omitted. Just if you're cutting and pasting, as we say on a computer, and you just block this section out and just moved it over, you have a discussion of Jesus with a woman talking about living water, and then you move right on to when the disciples come back, and it flows real well, entirely without the discussion about worship. Not everything, being a very poor writer, I'll admit that. I have a hard time getting things to flow and connect. I get all these points, and I spend a lot of time writing. You'd think reading my article, it shouldn't take that long to get a little piece of thing if I have time to do that. But I write, I think, I rewrite, I add points, I rewrite, and then I even have other people looking at it for me to help me to make it say what I want it to say, because I want it to flow. But see, what I'm saying is that this whole thing, you could have edited out the section about the woman discussing all this, and it still would have flowed through just fine. And now, let me add to that there is a lot, as John mentions at the end of his book, a lot about Jesus, signs, miracles, and lessons, and all those things that he did that aren't written in this book. Remember, these things are the book couldn't hold all the things that Jesus did, but these things are written that you might believe. So, in other words, God has not included everything that Jesus did or Jesus said. It just wouldn't have been possible. But God does choose to include inspiring these people with some specific things to leave us to think about. And so, as I look at this in section here, and I know it could be easily taken out and you could just read through it and it made sense, I'm thinking God put this in here for a very specific reason, as is all that he's written in the Bible. And you could say that about everything. But it's so unique of all that's being talked about here about that is something to consider. Any thoughts? Anybody awake? Nobody raising hands there either, but you are smiling a little. Okay. So anyway, that's part of what I found interesting as I was going through this. Now, down to verse 27. This is where we want to pick up here with what's happening. So after the discussion is being taken place and Jesus mentions about worship, verse 27, just then the disciples came back. They marveled that he, that's Jesus now, was talking with a woman, but no one said to the woman, obviously he's looking at, what do you seek? Or to Jesus, why are you talking to her? Could have been about what's Jesus seeking out of it too for that moment. So think about this. This is probably for all 11 of these, or 12 of these apostles, the first time in their entire life, being good Jews, that they went to Samaria because Jews don't have dealings with Samaritans. Mentioned in the text, we know by cultural studies. They just didn't. They didn't buy from them. They didn't talk to them. If they happened to pass by one of them along the way, they just didn't even say anything. He just never. And so this is all unique. On top of this, Jesus, when he comes to Jacob's well, he says, I'm tired. And so he sends them into town, a Samaritan town, to go buy food for him. I think part of this is that Jesus is up to something. It's my feeling that Jesus, probably out of the 12 apostles, was probably the roughest and toughest guy out of the group. Now I realized that Peter, James, and John were fishermen. And because of that, of throwing those nets in the water, not casting a little rod and reel every day, and motoring around with a boat, they had heavy nets they had to throw out, pull in with fish. And so I'd say the upper body and even the legs, for all that matter, back and everything else, these were tough guys and strong. But being a carpenter would be just the same. Anybody that you've been around that's a carpenter, that does construction work, is not a weakling, right, guys? I'm looking over to some that do this all their time and done it all their life. They may not be muscle bound, but they're strong. They're tough. And they're used to handling a hard schedule, and they're used to handling tough jobs and never really wearing out. Now, if you had to do all that stuff without electricity, and every bit of your wood you're getting possibly out of the forest, and you're dragging it into town, and you're cutting it up into whatever shape you need to do, and you're doing every bit of that by hand, I'd say it's going to add to the body's strength even more. So I see Jesus being probably the roughest and toughest out of the 12. At least, if not even over the fishermen, on parallel with the guys that have been handling nets all their life. And I say all this to say, when Jesus is weary and sits down by the well, I think he's just playing it out. Like, I'm tired, you guys go into town, I need to sit here and rest. And they aren't going to argue with him, but he's setting them up. He's making them go into town without him. So they got to go down there and figure out on the way down to town who's going to deal with these Samaritans, because they've never done this before. We've got to go buy food. Now, I've mentioned this in different settings here at Central in times past. But I'm just envisioning, because the 12 guys are from different backgrounds, and because they argue along the way of who's greater than the other one. That's one of their standard things, and they're trying to outdo one another. Not that men ever outdo each other or anything like that, do they, guys? No. I'm greater than this, and I can do this, and I can make a better this, or I can beat you in weightlifting or arm wrestling. It's a typical guy thing. And now they're really going to get the exercise. Okay, who's going to speak up when we get to town? And just envision, rest of them looking at Peter and say, you're the one always speaking up. You do it. You do the talking. We don't want to talk. We'll stand here. They get into town. They do their thing. They buy the food and they get out. Now that's what's happening. And when they get out and they come back to Jesus, of all things, he's talking to a Samaritan. He didn't even have to. Why would the master be doing this? I mean, we had to go do this for food for him. But he's just sitting back having a casual conversation with this woman. And you think, what is she doing? She's coming out at a time, culturally speaking, that most of the women aren't coming out to get water. So she's probably a city outcast. And she chooses a time when she won't have to deal with anybody else when she comes and gets water. So she's by herself. It's a time that nobody else is out at the well, and here's Jesus. And he has a conversation with her. Now, having had 5 different husbands and living with another guy, she's probably used to being approached by men. And I wonder when she comments to him, why are you talking to me? What are you up to? Could be that she's implying some things that most guys would be interested in at any day and time. So Jesus, of course, has a good spiritual conversation with her, as you could expect. So after they're really wrapped up into spiritual connections, and the woman's feeling like, this is incredible. I am talking to the Messiah. Then these 12 guys show up, the ones who've had to go to town, and they come back, and they're standing and looking at like, what is she doing? Why is she approaching Jesus? What has she got on her mind? And they don't hear the conversation. They're going to be assuming the worst, probably. And so they look at Jesus and they marvel and they wonder what's happening. Now, this is part of the learning process for the apostles. I know I'm doing more talking and questioning. He sends the woman away, or she leaves actually, and she goes into town. And verse 29, it says that she says, "Come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" And they went out of town and were coming to him. I'm going to skip over that because I'm going to come back to it, but I want to just continue on with the disciples' discussion. So meanwhile, the disciples are urging him. Who has a New King James Version or King James? What does yours say? Yes. No, verse 31. Meanwhile, the disciples, mine says, urging him to eat.
In the meantime, his disciples urged him, saying, "Rabbi, eat."
Okay, so it says urging him. It's pretty much a strong emphasis. They didn't say, meanwhile, the disciples said, "Hey, Jesus, here's some food." Urging has that urgency connotation to it. Hurry up, eat, let's get out of here. Let's make this a fast food trip. They've already been in town. They've been with Samaritans. They didn't want to do that, but Jesus set them up for it, so they did. So they handle what Jesus asked them to do, literally, to go get me some food. And he has a conversation. So when they get back with the food, it's like, here it is, let's eat it, let's go. Because we're still in Samaria, and a lot of people in that town didn't like us. We're afraid maybe some of them followed us out of town. I don't know what they might have been thinking. But I bet you they weren't greeted very nicely. And maybe they had to be a little insistent about getting what they wanted. Maybe they had to pay a bit more because of this isn't their town. And the guys just twisted a little bit and did more. I don't think it was a pleasant journey. They're ready to get out. So they're urging him to hurry and eat. And what does he say? Verse 32. But he said to him, "I have food to eat that you did not know about." So the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him something to eat?" Now they're thinking, did he sit down and actually eat with that woman? You talk about anathema, as you use the term. How would they have ever thought that he would have done that? Jesus says to him, verse 34, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his works. Do not say, therefore, yet 4 months and then comes the harvest. Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see the fields that are white for harvest, for already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may rejoice together." What is all of this? He jumps from food to sowing and reaping and already eaten, but he hasn't, and it sounds a little confusing. And continuing on, verse 37, "For here the saying holds true, one sows and another reaps." Now watch 38. "I sent you to reap." He just sent them to town to do what? Buy food. Now he says, "I sent you to reap." Is he talking about what they just did? Because they thought they were supposed to go into town and buy food and come back out. And they hurry up and eat and get on our way. But now he says, "I sent you to reap that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor." Now, the Samaritans do have a Jewish background. Not completely Jew, but half. And the apostles went down and entered into the labor. He's talking about a spiritual connection. Meanwhile, verse 39 says, many of the Samaritans from the time believed in him because of the woman's testimony. So while, if you're envisioning how this probably is unfolding, the woman goes into town, Jesus is at the well, and the apostles are back there talking. And they're wanting to hurry, and he says, I sent you to reap. While he's having this discussion, the woman's coming back out with some of the people from town. As you see what's happening here. And verse 39, the Samaritans believed, and so when the Samaritans came to him, verse 40, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. Might as well read the rest of it. And they said to the woman, it's no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard it for ourselves, and we know that he is indeed the Savior of the world. Okay, there's a whole lot of things happening here. How many have gone to foreign countries and had to negotiate with people, buying from a marketplace or something like that, where you're really just having a conversation with the person? A few of y'all? Okay. Now, when you go down to the marketplace and you start talking to them, you feel how? How do you feel as a person that visiting there? You feel like you're fitting right in, or you feel a little out of place? So here's 12 men. When did 12 men go shopping for food? Really? Just think about it. The men don't usually go shopping for food at all, and I don't know that it did back then. So here's 12 men that don't fit in that country. They're out of place in so many different ways, it's incredible. And you know, these guys that are Samaritans are dressed different. They're just unique from everything else. And finally, they get somebody to talk to they can buy food from. And the comment is, what are you guys doing here? I've been on that side. I can remember in Argentina, the first time that I started talking to somebody in an open market. And I was buying some, I think I was with Melanie. We went everywhere together. We didn't break off. We were afraid we'd say something dumb, which I've done already in Spanish, trying to communicate. And what are you doing here? Ramon says to me. And as we're having a conversation, why are you Americans down here? We're trying to go up there and you move down here. I mean, it's so obvious that we're out of place. Our language, we look different. It's just everything. The apostles, there were people that contributed to it. Remember, Judas carried a money bag for them. And he often, as John will tell us later, dipped his hand into the till and got money from it. So there were donations given to him, women who helped support that Luke will emphasize. And so there were some wealthy people evidently along the way that did that. So they had money. They went into town. They're buying things. But here's the thing is, when Ramon in Argentina says, why are you here? I said, we've come here to teach the Bible. And the next question asked is, would you come to my house? Now that was amazing because you don't always get that response. And Ramon was one of our first converts. But here's the wide open door for these 12 guys to say, somebody says, why are you here? And say, you can't believe who we've got at the well right outside of town. They didn't say a word. Ample opportunity. What are you doing here? We're here because of Jesus. Where is he? He's right outside of town. It just, you couldn't help but have been able to say that so easily. Think of the phrase Jesus says, I sent you to reap. You restrained your mouth to keep from saying that. You went into town, it was all right there. All you had to do when they said is, what are you doing here? Say, Jesus. Who's he? Messiah? I mean, how much Bible do you have to know? Now there's the lesson for us. Out of all that's going on here, that John puts in here, that God wants us to see. Because as these apostles are doing apostles' work, they're not really doing apostles' work. They're out on a shopping venture buying food in a marketplace, and they're so out of place, it's unbelievable. And the apostles' work,
I was gonna say, this whole thing is not about food for the stomach.
no. Remember at the beginning of the session here, not our session, but the beginning of chapter, let's see here. Verse 4 of chapter 4, it says, and he had, I got that highlighted and underlined, he had to go through Samaria. He has to teach the apostles a lesson about getting into the lives of people no matter what their background might be. You've got to stop thinking like your normal way and realize that everybody should have an opportunity. And they missed it. And so when they come back out to town, he finally says, I sent you to reap into a labor that really wasn't part of your labor. It was way back when, culturally speaking, they were part of the Jewish nation. And I sent you to go into it again. And you came out empty-handed. And the woman, let's talk about this woman for just a moment. If we had in our assembly a woman who had 5 different husbands and was now living with somebody that wasn't her husband, how do you think everybody be thinking of her? I mean, what do you think? I mean, would she have a gang of people greeting her at the front door as she came in? And the wives would be standing back anytime any of the men went up and just said, hello, what are you doing talking to her? I mean, just any number of things. She wouldn't be asked to help in the fellowship meals. Come over here and help serve. You can be at the front line and greet people. And she wasn't the greeter. And if she happened to stand and talk to people at the front door, you go, oh no, what is she going to say? What are they going to think about us? So I just want you to think about the woman's reputation in that town. When she goes into town and she starts talking about Jesus, she has so many obstacles to get over because they know her. They know where she's been and what she's done. And she doesn't care at this point. So I can't help but think that it took a tremendous amount of effort on her part to convince anybody to come out of town to Jesus. And yet she doesn't give up.
She also took a lot of belief on her part.
A lot of belief on her part.
Because, if you're going to put yourself out like that, you have to truly believe in what the message is.
Truly. And she had to really believe the message. And she did. And I can't help but think, for the first time in that town's life, they saw a change in the woman they'd never seen before. As they say, they took note that she'd been with Jesus. Now that's written about the apostles in the book of Acts. But nonetheless, it made a difference. And all of a sudden, her life wasn't about a man or a whatever. It was about Jesus. It was about the Messiah. She did something that convinced those people to look beyond her background and to check it out. And so quite a few went out there. And they believed because of the woman's word enough to get out there. And when they heard him, it was even more so. And to put icing on top of the cake. Remember now, the apostles went into town, came back out empty-handed. She goes in and she brings the town out there, which is what their job should have been. And they didn't. And then in this whole process, they're still urging him to hurry up and eat. And the town's coming out. Come on, Jesus, let's eat. They're coming out here. These are the one, oh, there's the one that just sold us the stuff. Oh no, here he didn't like us before. We maybe made some comments, Jesus, we shouldn't have made to him as we were leaving. And here he comes out here, and all of this is happening. And then they say, would you stay here a while? And the apostles are going, no, don't. And Jesus says, yeah, I think we will. Oh, no. Just think about the two sides here of the lesson that Jesus had to teach them by putting them into Samaria.
I've got it's not in the Bible, but you're going hypothetical. Jesus had the apostles all pick up stones and carry them. They picked up various sizes.
Wait a minute, where did he have them picking up stones?
This is not in the Bible, it's hypothetical.
Oh, hypothetical. If he had them picking up stones.
And they carried him a while. Then he got to a point where he turned them into bread. Later,
He's dreaming up at a potential. It's not in the Bible. Okay.
Later, he asked them to pick up stones again, and they all picked up heavy stones and carried them for a while. Got to some water, and he said, "Throw them into the water." And they were all astonished, thought they were going to have bread. He said, "Who are you carrying these stones for? Me or you?" And that story reminds me of what you're saying. What are you doing your work for, me or you?
Okay. Now I got your conclusion there. And I had to follow that whole
Like I say, it's
But-
not in the Bible.
right.
It's just that when you were going hypothetically, what so-and-so said or did or whatever, and that was a story I've heard that, what are you trying to gain for yourself or for me?
Okay, the point for those that might not be able to hear online here, we're discussing a little bit about the whole effort the apostles have. Is it for themselves, or is it because Jesus is asking and they're doing it for him? Which is obvious that that's the case. And it draws from what we're seeing here. But the message for the people is to the apostles is, this is a learning experience. And it'll come down to when you get to the book of Acts and you're starting off at the very beginning, in Acts chapter 1, the verse 8 gives us not only a good outline of the book of Acts, and it does that, but it tells us what Jesus' goal was. And so after the resurrection, the very beginning of the book of Acts has Jesus still with the apostles before he ascends into heaven. And he says to them, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, that's upper part, lower part, and Samaria, that middle part that he had to go through, and the uttermost parts of the world. And it still took convincing even after that for them to recognize that God was going to be allowing anybody into his kingdom before they became a Jew. That the Gentiles could go straight in without proselyting to Judaism to get in. That it was God's will that man be saved through Christ and not through Old Testament law. Not New Testament law, I'm saying, but the Old Testament law. And so this whole situation was a physical, hopefully heavy reminder in their mind of what God intended for them to do. That they were going to be going everywhere with the gospel. And so it was a training session for them to get to understand about what they would have to be doing. So he stayed 2 days longer. And I find it, they're a little off on the bell, are they not? No? The clock's a little slow. It's 10:15. Okay. We'll stop right there. Great message. Good for us. Because sometimes it's hard to cross lines and talk to people that you're not comfortable with. And yet that's the message that they had to learn and that we need to learn today. Let's close with a prayer. Father, thank you so much because of the message that Jesus has given to so many in a kind way and so valuable. Help us to hold it to our hearts and to be what Jesus wants us to be. Thank you for these words and for all of these people and those watching online.